A billionaire secretly created a $50 million error and attached it to the name of a struggling waitress. He expected greed. He expected excuses. What he never expected was that the one person with every reason to take the money would become the only person willing to tell the truth. Her decision would expose a hidden problem inside his empire and force him to rethink everything he believed about success, trust, and legacy. The fastest way to discover who deserves your fortune is to give them a chance to steal it. Ethan Caldwell stared at the sentence on his legal pad on this freezing Tuesday morning, his mind turning over the radical experiment he was about to launch. At 42 years old, Ethan had already accomplished what most men couldn't achieve in a century, driving Caldwell Dynamics from a garage startup into an American tech empire. Yet, sitting at the head of his high-rise boardroom, the immense wealth felt hollow. He watched a senior executive passionately praise a project Ethan had twice rejected, a project the same man had hated weeks ago, simply because he thought it was what Ethan wanted to hear. The whole room nodded in synchronized, smiling sycophancy. They had become experts at reading the billionaire rather than speaking the truth. Ending the meeting with a cold, abrupt wave, Ethan stood alone by the window as his phone buzzed with a message from Martin Reeves, the chief legal officer and the only man left in the building who refused to pretend. "I'm tired of the masks, Martin," Ethan confessed over the call, his voice hardening as he recalled a year's worth of internal reports showing executives manipulating data and covering tracks to protect their own corporate seats. An audit wouldn't fix this culture because people only behave when they know they are being watched. Ethan needed a blind test of raw human nature. He wanted to drop an unexpected temptation and see who would run with it and who would stand by the truth. He gave Martin the final green light to initiate the plan, completely unaware that his answers would not come from a corporate executive, but from a struggling young waitress whose absolute honesty was about to dismantle and rebuild everything he believed about his legacy. The plan began 48 hours later inside a private conference room located 3 floors beneath the executive offices of Caldwell Dynamics, a space originally designed for confidential merger negotiations where now only 2 men occupied the space. Ethan Caldwell sat at one end of the polished table while Martin Reeves reviewed a thick stack of legal documents. Martin slid a folder across the table, saying, "Everything has been prepared exactly as requested." Ethan opened it and examined the documents carefully. Instead of creating an illegal fake debt, Martin had utilized a real, long-forgotten escrow fund worth $50 million from one of Caldwell Dynamics' earliest acquisitions, which had sat unclaimed for decades due to an unresolved ownership dispute. Martin had intentionally altered the system's character recognition algorithm to create a simulated data routing error, causing the internal system to mistakenly flag Sarah Mitchell's name as the sole legal beneficiary of this genuine fund. To any auditor or executive reviewing the system, it appeared to be a massive, authentic compliance oversight, making it a perfectly legal internal crisis simulation to test executive integrity without violating corporate fraud laws. Could this survive scrutiny? Ethan asked, turning several pages. Martin nodded, long enough for the test to work. The mistake looks authentic and will trigger plenty of opinions. Ethan gave a small smile. Opinions are exactly what I expect. Looking at the final page, Ethan studied the single, ordinary name attached to the claim. How was she selected? Martin leaned back. We screened hundreds of candidates for someone with no connection to the company, no political influence, no unusual wealth, and no public history. She's 29, works as a waitress at a local roadside diner, and has a completely clean record. Ethan slowly closed the folder, fascinated by the thought that his entire tech empire, on paper, was now tied to a woman who spent her days serving coffee, oblivious to the legal storm gathering around her. What happens next? Ethan asked. The claim will process through internal channels for certain executives to discover, and eventually, the information will reach her, Martin replied, confirming that only the 2 of them knew the truth. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a sharp spark of curiosity about whether raw honesty still existed outside corporate mission statements. Later that evening, sitting in the back seat of his sedan as it traveled through working-class neighborhoods far removed from executive high-rises, Ethan watched ordinary people carrying grocery bags beneath glowing streetlights. Somewhere among these quiet streets was the stranger carrying his $50 million trap, and within a matter of days, he intended to meet her face to face without revealing who he truly was. 2 mornings later, Ethan Caldwell officially left behind the tailored suits, luxury vehicles, and executive privileges that normally surrounded his daily life to step into a completely different reality. He wore a faded brown canvas jacket with frayed cuffs, dark weathered jeans, and a simple black baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, a disguise that wasn't elaborate but highly effective, as nobody in their right mind ever expected a tech billionaire to be standing in a common breakfast line. Just after 7 o'clock, he stepped into a small, rustic diner located along a quiet county highway about 40 miles outside the city, where a small brass bell chimed softly above the entrance. The comforting scent of fresh coffee, toasted sourdough bread, and sizzling bacon instantly filled the air, cutting through the sharp winter chill. The diner was modest but incredibly welcoming, with pale morning sunlight streaming through the large, slightly fogged front windows. Local farmers in flannel shirts, truck drivers taking a quick break from the highway, and retirees occupied the vinyl booths scattered throughout the room. Nobody looked twice at Ethan, an absolute anonymity he hadn't experienced in decades and deeply appreciated. He chose a secluded booth near the back corner, ordering a basic black coffee from the older owner while quietly observing the morning routine. Within minutes, he spotted her, Sarah Mitchell, the 29-year-old waitress whose name now sat at the epicenter of his secret corporate storm. She moved quickly and gracefully between the crowded tables, balancing heavy breakfast plates and glass coffee pots with practiced ease. Her uniform was neatly pressed despite showing undeniable signs of age, and a small silver name tag rested above her apron pocket. What immediately caught Ethan's sharp attention was not her appearance, but her genuine manner. She treated every single customer with the exact same authentic warmth, making no distinction between a wealthy tourist and a regular local. When an elderly man at a nearby table struggled to read the menu without his glasses, Sarah didn't rush him. Instead, she patiently crouched down to his eye level and read every single breakfast special aloud with a warm smile. Moments later, when a young mother entered carrying a restless, crying toddler, Sarah appeared at their booth with crayons and drawing paper before the stressed mother could even think to ask. There was absolutely nothing dramatic about her actions, no performance, no grand gesture, just quiet, instinctual kindness repeated over and over throughout the busy morning rush. Eventually, Sarah approached Ethan's corner table with a fresh coffee pot in hand. "Good morning," she said warmly, her voice bright despite the long shift. "Can I start you with some hot coffee?" "Please," Ethan replied, watching her pour the steaming liquid into his ceramic mug. As she handed him a laminated menu, she tilted her head with a soft laugh. "First time here?" Ethan nodded, amused. "Is it that obvious?" Sarah smiled, adjusting her notepad. "Well, you spent 2 full minutes studying the menu board before you even sat down, and you looked a little overwhelmed by the noise. Our regulars usually walk in and order their usual without looking up." Ethan found himself smiling genuinely, a rare feeling for him. "That is a very fair observation. I'll just take the blueberry pancakes, please." "Coming right up," she replied cheerfully before moving back toward the kitchen. After eating his meal, Ethan continued to watch her navigate the diner. As the initial morning rush slowly began to decelerate around 9 o'clock, Ethan noticed Sarah quietly helping the elderly diner owner restock heavy boxes of supplies near the back counter. A few minutes later, believing no one was watching, she slipped a $20 bill from her own modest tip money into a plastic collection jar on the counter, raising funds for a local family facing sudden medical expenses. She glanced around quickly, clearly hoping her donation would remain anonymous, completely unaware that the billionaire in the corner booth noticed everything. Moments later, an old truck driver sitting at the counter nearby noticed Ethan's gaze, leaned over, and said quietly, "If you're wondering, it's always busy here mostly because of Sarah. People trust her around here because she actually cares about this community." Ethan looked back across the room as Sarah refilled another cup, realizing that here, in a roadside diner far removed from corporate headquarters and boardroom politics, he had finally found the rare, uncorrupted integrity he had been searching for. As he paid his bill, left a generous but non-suspicious tip, and prepared to leave, he became more convinced than ever that she was exactly the person he needed to test. 4 days later, the first stage of Ethan's calculated experiment officially reached its intended destination. Sarah Mitchell had just finished an exhausting double shift at the diner when she pulled a large, heavy certified envelope from her rusted mailbox. The formal return address belonged to a high-profile legal firm in the city she had never heard of, instantly making her assume it was a simple postal mistake. She almost tossed it unopened onto her kitchen counter, but curiosity eventually won. After changing into comfortable clothes and cooking a basic dinner, she carefully sliced open the envelope and began reading. Within seconds, utter confusion clouded her face, which quickly spiraled into total disbelief as she reread the complex paperwork a second, then a third time. According to the dense legal terminology, she was named as the sole beneficiary of an unresolved $50 million financial claim involving Caldwell Dynamics. The numbers printed across the page looked entirely unreal to a woman who earned less than $40,000 a year. Her apartment suddenly felt suffocatingly quiet as rain tapped softly against the glass. $50 million belonged to a different universe. Her reality consisted of calculating grocery prices, postponing urgent car repairs for 6 months, and drowning in student loan payments from an incomplete college education. Her instincts screamed that something was dangerously wrong, yet every page bore official certifications, legal stamps, and legitimate corporate references. The next morning, her hands shook as she showed the documents to her coworker Denise during a break. Denise nearly dropped her coffee mug, staring wide-eyed at the pages. "Sarah, do you even comprehend what this means?" Denise gasped. "You could walk out of this diner right now and never pour another cup of coffee for the rest of your life." Sarah shook her head nervously. "It has to be an administrative error, Denise. I'm going to contact them to fix it." Denise laughed, waving her hands. "Are you crazy? If a multi-billion-dollar corporation accidentally hands me $50 million, I am running straight to the bank, not to their customer service department." Throughout the day, the unbelievable news quietly spread to a few regular customers, and every piece of advice Sarah received was surprisingly consistent. They urged her to hire an aggressive attorney, stay silent, and wait for the money to clear. Nobody seemed to care about the truth, only the windfall. Meanwhile, inside the luxury glass tower of Caldwell Dynamics, the simulated claim was producing a completely different kind of chaos. Martin Reeves stood in Ethan's office, reviewing the early telemetry of the trap. "The senior executives are already panicking behind closed doors, Ethan," Martin reported, his tone laced with disappointment. "Our chief operating officer immediately suggested burying the claim in procedural delays, and the financial team is scrambling to cover up any potential public embarrassment. Not a single person has asked why or how this error happened, they are only focused on protecting their own reputations and bonuses." Ethan stared out the window, his expression hardening as the reports confirmed his worst fears about his corporate culture. Late that evening, Sarah sat alone at her kitchen table once again, staring at the legal folder resting beside her overdue utility bills and a terrifying car repair estimate. For a brief, agonizing moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life of absolute financial security, no more second jobs, no more freezing mornings in a broken car, and a beautiful new home for her mother. The temptation was a physical weight in her chest, but as she traced the cold letters of the Caldwell Dynamics logo, a quiet, stubborn voice inside her head grew louder, asking the one question her integrity would not let her ignore: what if this money was never meant to be yours in the first place? Over the next several days, the legal documents followed Sarah Mitchell everywhere like a ghost promising an impossible escape. They sat on her kitchen table while she paid bills, occupied the passenger seat of her aging sedan during her cold drives to work, and rested inside her locker at the diner while she served customers. No matter where she went, the whisper of $50 million remained close enough to tempt her thoughts. One afternoon, after finishing a brutal lunch shift, Sarah stopped at an auto repair shop to check on her unreliable vehicle. The mechanic, wiping grease from his hands, looked at her with an empathetic but grim expression. "It's the transmission, Sarah," he said, tapping a clipboard. To get this car running safely again, it's going to cost you nearly $3,000. The words caused a tight knot to instantly form in her stomach. 3,000, she whispered, staring at the estimate. I don't have that right now. He sighed, I'm sorry, but without the repairs, it's a ticking time bomb. She thanked him and walked back to her car, sitting behind the wheel as her eyes drifted toward the folder containing the legal claim. For the first time, she did not look away immediately. She allowed herself to vividly imagine a reality where the money was truly hers, paying every debt, replacing this broken car, moving her mother into a safer community, and finally finishing the college education she had abandoned years ago because of tuition costs. When she finally started the engine, she felt a wave of guilt for how comforting those forbidden thoughts had been. That evening, she visited her mother, who lived in a modest retirement community outside town. Sharing the news with her coworker Denise and listening to the endless, greedy whispers of the diner customers all day had become completely exhausting. Everyone was pressuring her to take the money, making her feel entirely isolated in her desire to do the right thing. After dinner, she finally sought refuge in her mother's quiet living room, explaining the entire situation. Her mother listened without a single interruption, studying her daughter's stressed face before asking a single, piercing question: "What would you do, Sarah, if nobody in the entire world ever discovered the truth?" Sarah hesitated, staring at her hands as tears welled in her eyes. "Everyone at the diner thinks I'm crazy for wanting to return it, Mom," Sarah whispered softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I am so tired of calculating every single grocery purchase and worrying about this broken car. I still remember when Dad's small grocery store went bankrupt years ago, and how that exact bankruptcy was the reason I had to drop out of college because we suddenly couldn't afford my tuition. Yet, instead of running away, Dad spent 5 long years working brutal night shifts just to pay back every single supplier, even though the court said he didn't legally have to. Everyone called him a fool, but he always told me that character is what you do when nobody is watching, and a clean conscience is the only pillow that never gets hard. He died leaving me to work for tips, but he left me a name that was never tarnished. If I keep this $50 million, I'm erasing the only beautiful thing Dad ever taught me." Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand firmly. "There is nothing wrong with wishing life were easier, sweetheart. But there is something deeply wrong with taking a future you didn't earn." The conversation ended, but over the next 2 nights, sleep became impossible as Sarah stared at her ceiling, caught between the life she desperately wanted and the truth. Meanwhile, inside the luxury headquarters of Caldwell Dynamics, the experiment was revealing far more than Ethan had anticipated. Martin Reeves walked into his office with a fresh stack of logs, his face dark. 3 senior executives are actively trying to bury the claim, Ethan, Martin reported. One wants to trick her into a cheap settlement, and the others are creating procedural delays to make the whole issue disappear quietly without an internal audit. They are instinctively protecting the corporation and their own bonuses before seeking the truth. Ethan reviewed the report with profound disappointment, but his eyes locked onto the update regarding Sarah's activities. "And what about Miss Mitchell?" Ethan asked. "She hasn't contacted a lawyer or a single reporter," Martin replied, amazed. "Instead, she's spent her nights contacting public records to verify if our paperwork contains a system error." Ethan found himself staring at that detail in awe. Given $50 million, most people would focus on securing it, yet Sarah was focused entirely on understanding the truth. Across town, Sarah sat once more at her kitchen table, staring at 2 distinct piles, one containing her unpaid bills and repair estimates, and the other containing the corporate folder. With a heavy, painful breath, she reached forward and firmly closed the folder, letting go of the tempting fantasy. Her car was still broken and her bills remained unpaid, but an unexpected sense of absolute peace settled over her. Unaware that a billionaire was monitoring her every move, Sarah placed the folder into her bag, ready to drive 40 miles to return what was never hers. 3 days after making her final decision, Sarah Mitchell requested a formal day off from the diner for the first time in nearly 4 months to resolve the overwhelming corporate situation. She had initially tried calling and emailing Caldwell Dynamics customer support multiple times to report the system mistake, but her urgent messages were consistently ignored or answered by automated bots, leaving her terrified that she might be held legally liable or penalized for tax complications regarding the $50 million. Realizing she could not handle a multi-billion-dollar corporation alone, she asked her close friend David, an idealistic legal aid attorney who handled pro bono cases, to escort her to the financial district for protection against aggressive corporate tactics. As they parked Sarah's rusting sedan blocks away and approached the towering glass and steel monument of Caldwell Dynamics headquarters, the sheer scale of the financial district felt incredibly intimidating, but having David beside her gave Sarah the grounded courage she needed to step through the revolving doors. The interior lobby was even more massive than the exterior, with polished marble floors stretching beneath enormous light fixtures and digital displays showcasing company achievements. Security personnel monitored the entrance while receptionists assisted visitors with cold, practiced efficiency. Sarah approached the front desk, and after David presented his legal credentials, they were promptly escorted to a secure waiting area on the 22nd floor. News of her arrival traveled instantly inside the upper echelons, especially since $50 million was at stake. Unbeknownst to them, Ethan Caldwell was watching their every move via live security footage from a private observation room alongside Martin Reeves. She didn't run to the media, but she brought a legal aid attorney, Ethan murmured, leaning closer to the screen. Martin nodded approvingly. Smart girl. No press, no public threats. She just wants protection, not a fight. 20 minutes later, Sarah and David were invited into a grand conference room where 3 senior executives awaited them. The corporate atmosphere was polite but noticeably defensive as bottled water was offered and formal introductions were exchanged. One executive leaned forward with a tight smile. "Miss Mitchell, we understand you have serious questions regarding certain high-level legal documents." Sarah placed the folder on the table and calmly slid it toward them. "Actually, I think there may be a profound system error," she said without hesitation. The executives exchanged brief, panicked glances before another asked, "An error, you say?" Sarah nodded firmly. "I received paperwork suggesting I have a massive claim connected to your company, but I cannot see how it could possibly be correct. I came here to return it because somebody needs to fix this data." For a moment, a heavy silence fell over the room. From the screen, Ethan watched in absolute awe. Sarah did not try to negotiate, hint at compensation, or seek financial leverage. She simply wanted to return what never belonged to her. One executive offered a calculated smile. "You do realize that if this claim were valid, the financial implications could completely change your life." Sarah looked him dead in the eye and smiled politely. "That still does not make the money mine." Beside her, David shifted his papers, ready to intervene if the executives pressured her, but Sarah's raw honesty was already destroying their corporate defense. Behind the polished table, the executives struggled to conceal their shock. They had spent days preparing for an aggressive legal battle, but they were completely unprepared for straightforward, uncorrupted honesty. Watching from the dark room, Ethan felt a sudden, rare surge of pure hope. A waitress who had driven 40 miles had just proven to him that real human integrity still existed. The meeting should have ended within 15 minutes, but as the calculated discussion continued, troubling details began attracting Sarah's attention. The 3 senior executives seemed completely uninterested in correcting the database error. Instead, they were desperately trying to make the $50 million situation disappear. One executive leaned forward, sliding a document across the table, suggesting they prepare a private, non-disclosure agreement to acknowledge her cooperation through internal channels without creating any official corporate records. Their professional words sounded polished, but the underlying pressure made Sarah deeply uncomfortable. Before she could speak, her attorney David immediately intercepted the document, scanning it with a cold frown. "This is a sweeping NDA," David said firmly, his legal voice cutting through the tension. "You are asking my client to legally bind herself to silence over a massive internal error that she didn't commit." Sarah listened closely before looking directly at the executives, asking a simple question: "Will there be an official, transparent correction to the records?" The executives exchanged quick, nervous glances before one replied, "That may not be necessary, Miss Mitchell, the matter is highly complicated. Sarah's brow furrowed. If there was a mistake in my name, should it not be fixed properly? The room grew noticeably quieter. From the dark observation suite, Ethan Caldwell watched her every reaction through the glass, his breath catching slightly. For the first time in years, he wasn't just observing a test subject. At 42, he found himself intensely captivated by her unyielding poise and the fiercely beautiful conviction in her eyes. Beside him, Martin Reeves quietly took notes, but Ethan's gaze remained locked entirely on Sarah. What fascinated him was how effortlessly this young waitress was exposing his executive's twisted priorities. Sarah focused entirely on accuracy, while his highest-paid leaders focused only on self-preservation and containment. Another executive tried to smooth things over. Our primary concern is resolving this efficiently, Miss Mitchell, so we can close the matter. Sarah looked down at the documents, then back up, her voice steady and resolute. Respectfully, hiding an error under a private agreement does not sound like the same thing. If these records are wrong, somebody within this empire should know exactly how they became wrong. Otherwise, how do you know it will not happen again? Hearing her words, Ethan slowly smiled behind the glass, feeling a strange, unfamiliar warmth blooming in his chest. She was asking the exact question that had haunted his own sleepless nights for months. As the discussion dragged on, the executives began contradicting one another, their corporate masks slipping as they panicked under David's sharp legal counterarguments. Sarah wasn't a corporate lawyer, but her sharp intuition recognized when explanations failed to align. "I am sorry," she said politely, interrupting their corporate jargon. "Maybe I am misunderstanding, but everyone around this table seems to be describing a completely different procedure." An awkward, heavy silence followed. Martin quietly handed Ethan a document containing past transcripts that mirrored the exact contradictions Sarah had just uncovered. Ethan reviewed the notes, his disappointment in his executives hardening into certainty, but his heart felt remarkably light whenever he looked back at Sarah. The experiment had begun as a clinical test of integrity, but looking at her now, Ethan realized it had evolved into something deeply personal. He didn't just respect her, he admired her. As the meeting finally concluded, Martin turned to him. "Well?" Ethan stared through the glass as Sarah gathered her things, a genuine, possessive pride softening his expression. "She passed, Martin," Ethan whispered quietly, his eyes tracking her until she left the room. The others did not. For the first time since the plan began, the billionaire was no longer thinking just about the future of Caldwell Dynamics, he was thinking about the extraordinary woman who had just entered his world, and how he would earn the right to stand beside her. The following Monday morning, the executive board of Caldwell Dynamics gathered inside the company's grandest conference room, assuming they were attending a routine quarterly leadership review. Several executives who had participated in the meeting with Sarah Mitchell appeared exceptionally confident, sharing quiet jokes and believing the potential $50 million leak had been successfully contained under their forced legal pressure. Across the city, Sarah was beginning another ordinary morning shift at the roadside diner, completely unaware that her actions were about to trigger a massive corporate earthquake. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy doors opened and Ethan Caldwell entered the room. The chatter stopped instantly. He greeted no one, his face unreadable as he walked straight to the front and activated the massive presentation screen. A single, chilling title appeared, Internal Integrity Review. Before anyone could whisper, Ethan spoke, his voice carrying a calm but dangerous weight. "For years, I believed the greatest threat to Caldwell Dynamics would come from aggressive competitors, economic crashes, or technological disruption. I was wrong. The greatest threat came from within this room, from a toxic culture that slowly learned to prioritize personal comfort and cover-ups over the absolute truth." He advanced the slide, and internal emails, private chat logs, and secret meeting minutes regarding the escrow fund immediately flashed across the screen. Ethan carefully walked through each response, exposing their recommendations to hide the issue, delay audits, and trick an innocent citizen into a predatory silence. The chief operating officer's face drained of color as his own words stared back at him. Ethan then displayed the final slide, featuring a comprehensive summary of Sarah Mitchell's actions, her refusal to claim a fortune that wasn't hers, and her decision to bring a pro bono legal aid attorney not to extort the company, but to ensure the system error was properly documented and corrected. "Are you saying this entire $50 million claim was nothing but a calculated trap?" the chief financial officer finally demanded, standing up as anger masked his embarrassment. "We were only trying to protect the corporate reputation and shield the stock price from unnecessary panic." Ethan met his panicked gaze with absolute, chilling composure. "The claim was fictional, the risk was controlled, but your self-serving responses were entirely real. You didn't protect the company, you protected your own bonuses and hid a system defect because transparency created an inconvenience." The room fell into a suffocating, dead silence as the executives realized their careers were over. Ethan turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the expansive skyline before delivering his final verdict. He announced an immediate, sweeping restructuring. 3 senior executives were terminated effectively on the spot, others were placed under independent forensic review, and strict transparency oversight. Procedures were implemented across every division. The brutal purge was not merely about punishment, it was about forcefully rebuilding the foundation of trust that had built his legacy. Later that afternoon, Ethan stood alone in his quiet office as the city lights began to blink awake, looking out over the expansive skyline. For decades, he had measured his life's stability through quarterly revenue, market cap, and physical assets. Now, he finally understood how fragile those glass towers could become when moral values eroded beneath them. Ironically, the strongest pillar of integrity he had found did not come from an Ivy League graduate or a high-paid consultant, but from a struggling waitress who served coffee and chose the truth when given the chance to take millions. Looking at the glittering city below, the 42-year-old billionaire felt a profound, aching confidence that the core values which built his empire were still worth fighting for, and he knew exactly where he needed to go next. 3 weeks after her tense visit to Caldwell Dynamics, Sarah Mitchell genuinely believed the entire overwhelming situation had finally ended, and her life slowly returned to its familiar, quiet rhythm. She continued working her demanding morning shifts at the roadside diner, spent her quiet weekends visiting her mother, and kept carefully saving every dollar she could toward her steep car repair estimate. The mysterious $50 million claim had completely disappeared from her daily thoughts, assuming the formal thank you email from their legal department was the last she would ever hear of it. Then, on a remarkably bright Thursday afternoon, a sleek black luxury sedan pulled into the diner's gravel parking lot. Sarah barely noticed it at first, busy delivering fresh coffee to a booth of regular truckers, but the moment she turned toward the entrance, she froze in absolute shock. The man stepping through the door was instantly recognizable, his face a staple on business news networks and magazine covers: Ethan Caldwell. For a dizzying second, Sarah wondered if she was imagining things as the powerful billionaire scanned the room, his eyes softening into a warm smile when he finally locked gaze with her. Suddenly, the memory of the quiet customer in the faded brown jacket and baseball cap struck her with intense clarity. It had been him observing her all along. As whispers erupted across the room and the diner owner stood frozen in disbelief, Ethan walked directly toward Sarah's corner table. "Good afternoon, Sarah," he said warmly, his voice stripped of all corporate authority. "I hope I am not interrupting your work." Sarah stared at him for a long moment before letting out a soft laugh of sheer disbelief. "You're the quiet stranger who ordered the blueberry pancakes." Ethan smiled gently. "I am, and I owe you a proper explanation." During her scheduled break, they sat together in the exact same secluded booth where their journey had begun. Ethan laid bare the entire truth, describing his profound exhaustion with the deceptive corporate culture surrounding him, the strategic purpose of the simulated escrow error, and how the corrupt executives who tried to bury it had all been terminated and placed under forensic investigation. Sarah listened quietly, a flicker of hurt crossing her face before she spoke with guarded dignity. "So, I was just a test subject in a billionaire's game." Ethan immediately reached across the table, his expression filled with rare, vulnerable sincerity. "At first, yes, but you completely destroyed the game, Sarah. Many people with every socioeconomic advantage chose pure self-interest, yet you, with every financial reason to look the way, chose absolute honesty." Sarah looked down at her ceramic cup, her voice dropping to a soft whisper, it was simply the right thing to do, regardless of the money. A week later, Sarah stood once more inside the towering headquarters of Caldwell Dynamics, but this time she wasn't there to return records, she was the guest of honor. In a grand press conference packed with employees and media, Ethan officially announced the creation of the Mitchell Integrity Foundation, dedicated to funding educational scholarships and community support programs for working-class families. Turning to a stunned Sarah, Ethan publicly invited her to become a founding partner. To actively guide the organization, proving that her character was the ultimate asset that money could never buy. As thunderous applause filled the room, Ethan caught her eye, and the unspoken promise of a shared future passed between them, sealing a legacy built not on glass towers, but on the unyielding courage of doing the right thing when nobody is watching.